Okay, let's first look at selectors. Selectors are the part of the CSS entry that designate which entries in the page the styles apply to. So here's an example. Each entry in your CSS file consists of two parts. The first part is the selector pattern. It designates what the styles apply to. The second part, in curly braces, give the properties and the property values. If there's a match, what should you do to the thing that matches? And as we saw in the previous section, if you just put an HTML element, that means these styles apply to all P's in the page automatically. We also saw in the last section that for the selector, we could give something that started with a dot. If it starts with a dot, then it applies to elements in the page that specifically refer to that name with class equals. And again, remember that when you use class equals, you don't supply the dot. You supply the dot in the CSS file, but not in the HTML file. But there are many other selector patterns. Here's a quick example. This selector pattern, kind of work from right to left here instead of left to right, means the colors apply only to TDs, but not to all TDs, only TDs that are inside tables that say class equals colored. So you can kind of nest them, and so you can make more specific designations. Not all tables, not all rows, not all TDs, but only ones that appear in this particular context. And how you designate this context, what kinds of patterns you can put for the CSS selectors, is the topic of this lecture. Now, I'll give the most important ones in this section, but I'm not going to give all of them. And so if you want to see every last one, go to the official specification, and it lists every last one with details and examples. Okay, here's some quick examples, and then we'll come back and give more details on each entry. So you can have something that begins with a pound. We haven't seen that before. Pound corresponds to HTML that uses ID. So if I say pound something or another, then that can only apply to at most one element in the page, because remember, IDs have to be unique within the page. If I just give an HTML element, it applies to all P's automatically. If I give something that starts with a dot, as we saw, it applies to anything in the page that uses class. If you have spaces, it means nesting. So P space span means those styles apply to spans, but not necessarily to all spans in the page, only spans that are inside of a P, although they don't necessarily have to be directly inside. They could be inside a div that's inside the P, so they could be nested. So space means nesting, but not necessarily direct nesting. And then you can use commas for or. So if I use h1, comma, h2, comma, tdli, that means those styles apply to any h1 in the page. Those styles also apply to any h2 in the page. And those styles also apply to any li in the page that happens to be inside of a td. All right, so those are the most common. You have IDs, you have HTML elements, you have classes, you have nesting, and you have options with commas. But there's many more. So let's give a summary. So the next few slides are tables. I'm not going to go through them in great detail. This is something that you want to go back to, freeze the screen, and refer to as a kind of pocket reference to CSS. But I'll summarize them quickly. We saw this one already. That is an HTML element. So if I say li and I give some CSS properties, we'll discuss the properties in the next section, in curly braces, it applies to all li elements in the page. Pound sign applies to IDs. If it starts with a dot, then you have to use class in the HTML to refer to it. And you can kind of hook them together. If I say some element dot some class name, for example, div dot important, then that means it applies to HTML elements that are of type div, but only if they also say class equals important. And you can do the same thing with an ID. You can hook it together. So if I say, for example, form pound sign blah, that applies to the form element, but only if it says ID equals blah. And then you can have a star. A star means it matches anything. Well, what's the point of matching anything? It matches any, why you say it, you can just quite easy to do. And star is particularly used when you subtract things later with not. So rather than saying it only applies to H2s, you can say, well, it applies to everything, except not H2s. And you can kind of start with everything and subtract stuff out rather than the normal approach, which is you start with nothing and you add in. Okay, so those are the most basic selectors. Typically, you then look at nesting. And by far the most common nesting approach is a space. So in my little reference tables, when I say S1, S2, I mean some other pattern that we described earlier. So the idea is if you take any CSS pattern and you put a space and you put another CSS pattern, it applies to the second pattern. But only if the second pattern is inside something that matches the first pattern. Not necessarily directly inside, but inside. So here's a quick example. If I say div.foo space span.bar, that means that it applies only to spans, but spans that say class equals bar. But only spans that say class equals bar that are inside the first thing, which is a div with class equals foo. So space means nesting, but not necessarily direct nesting. If I had a div with class equals foo and it had another div inside of it, and that div had a p inside of it, and that p had a span class equals bar inside of that, it would still match. If you only want direct nesting to match, you use a greater than sign. This is much less common. Much more common is to just use a space for nesting. We saw that comma means it matches either of those, or another way of saying it is the pattern applies to both of those. A plus sign means next to. So if I say label plus input, that means it applies to input, but only if the input is immediately after a label. If I want to say it applies to input, but where it's somewhere after a label, I could use the tilde. That's much more rare. So by far the most common of these is the space, which means nesting, but not necessarily direct nesting. Learn the top one. Learn the one with the space. Be aware that the other ones exist. When you become more of a CS expert, you can come back and learn the details, but you don't really need to learn the other ones now. Just know about the space for nesting. All right, and then if you use square brackets, it applies to attributes. Remember we saw H1 align equals center, or table border equals 1. Align and border were attributes. And so you can search for something that has an attribute of that name. You can search for something that has an attribute that matches a value. You can search for something that has an attribute, the little hat means starts with a value. You can search for something that has an attribute that ends with a value. You can search for something that has an attribute that contains the value. You can say not. It's not equal to that value, and so forth. So let's give a few examples. If I say a square brackets name, search for an a element that has a name attribute. I don't care what that name attribute is, just that it has one, because normally a uses href, not name. If I use equal sign, it says match it exactly. So search for an a element that has an href whose value is exactly #sect2. Or suppose I want to look for all internal hypertext links in the page. Remember that they always start with, the caret means the little up arrow thing means start with, they always start with a $. So I could say starts with $. I could say end with. Find all hypertext links that end with jQuery.com, or that contain jQuery.com, or that are not, and here's another way of doing not, some particular value. So CSS classes, something with a dot, are the most common, and nesting is the most common way of making the pattern more specific. But there's lots of others as well. Colon first, so the idea is that S is some existing CSS pattern, anything we've seen in the previous slides. And then if you put colon first or colon last, the first entry in the page or the last entry in the page. Or if you say equal 3, it's the third entry in the page. You You can also say greater than or less than an entry in the page, and you can also say it's an even or an odd entry in the page. Now, all of those sound like they're useful. Look for the first TR in the page. Oh, that's probably the heading. But they're not as useful as they look. Because the first TR in the page might not be the heading. The first TR in each of the tables might be the heading. So what's actually more useful is first child. If you say TR colon first child, that says this is not necessarily the first TR in the entire page. This is the first TR of the thing that the TR is inside. What can TR be inside? It can be inside table. So this is the first TR of its parent, its enclosing table. So this is a way of saying, oh, the first row of a table should be styled differently than the other rows of a table. You can say nth child, last child, only child, but the most common one is first child. You can see if the actual body content contains a particular string. Now, this is extremely powerful. And when I first came across this in jQuery, I said, oh, wow, this is cool. jQuery can do something that regular CSS can't. But then I went back and looked at the most recent CSS specification, and it turned out you could do this after all. So look at this example here. So the way to interpret this is the styles that are described in the curly braces apply only to LI elements, but only LI elements whose text, the body content inside the LI, actually contains the word, as to match the case, wow. And only an LI, if it contains wow, that's inside something with class equals foo. Pretty powerful. You can check for empty elements, elements that don't have any body content. You can say, find the parent. Parent means the enclosing tag. This is actually quite useful when you get to tables and table cells. You often look for something in a particular table cell, but then you color the row that contains it. So div colon parent means this div is a parent. It contains something. It's not empty.